Chapter 28, Chapter 28. Chapter 28, Cinnabar. Inhaling deeply and looking up at the sky, holding the crisp air in his lungs for a second before sighing, Professor Oak rested his hands on his belt and looked over at Ash. The young gym leader stood a few paces away from the older man, both of them fastening up the last buckles and straps of their armor. Behind the professor, Claire rolled her head around, popped her neck, and held her bow out at arm's length. Without knocking an arrow, the woman pulled back on the composite weapon's string and slowly let the bow return to its restful state. "Hey," Oak walked over to Ash and put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "I wasn't sure how to handle the subject earlier, but I'm sorry to hear about Misty and Pikachu. I wanted you to know I'm here if you need to get anything off your chest." Turning to face Oak, Ash nodded and crossed his arms in front of his chest. "I know," he said, taking a steady breath. "I appreciate it, but really Grandpa, I'm going to be alright." He tried to grin. "You know me. That's why I bring it up," said the old man. "I don't want you holding it all in." Looking away for a second, Ash spotted Janine standing on the edge of the tree line ringing in the small clearing. "There's nothing left to hold in," Ash said. "I'm just going to take things one day at a time and leave the past in they." He turned and took a step for Janine, but Oak's strong hand falling on his shoulder rooted him in place. "One thing," said the professor, reaching to his belt and pulling off a Pokeball. He held the little device up for Ash to take. "I didn't want you to think I had forgotten." "Misty's Blastoise?" Ash asked. Oak nodded. "Back to 100%, courtesy of Bill. Charizard, Blastoise, Arcanine, Pidgeot, Munchlax, Vaporeon, and..." Ash cut himself off as Haunter giggled, "That's it. Elm won't know what hit him." Oak cleared his throat and nodded off towards Janine. "Changing subjects, are you absolutely sure about that girl?" "Relax," Ash grinned a little. "If she wanted to kill me, she could have done it 1,000 times by now. Janine's really a lot nicer than she comes across. Just let her warm up to you a little." "If you're certain," said the professor. Ash nodded and turned to walk for the edge of the clearing. He stepped up beside Janine and put a hand on her shoulder. The girl glanced sideways at him with a twitch, her expression flashing from serene to alert and back again. "What's up?" She smiled from beneath her purple hood. "We'll be leaving soon," said Ash. "Grandpa thinks we'll hit Cinnabar before nightfall if the weather's with us." "Awesome," responded the girl. "You don't sound too enthused," Ash noted, trying to sound reassuring and giving her shoulder a squeeze, realizing a little too late she probably couldn't feel the gesture through her armor. "The last few days have just gone by too quickly," Janine answered, reaching up and laying her hand on Ash's. "More than a week since we left Pallet and it feels like less than an hour. At this rate..." She stopped and let the statement hang. "Good thing I've got you to keep me out of trouble," Ash nudged her with his elbow. Janine smirked and pulled her hood down, bunching it up around her collar. "I told you already," she teased, turning into him and putting a finger up on Ash's lip. "I'm here for my own selfish reasons. One of which happens to be keeping you alive." Ash and Janine returned to Oak and Claire, the latter of which had busied herself with finishing off one of the cigarettes she seemed to constantly have on hand. Pausing to check the group's radios, Ash stopped in his work for a second and turned his head as Haunter prodded for his attention. "Still don't like the woman," the ghost whispered, all mischief gone from its tone. "Hiding something." Concentrating for a second to locate the ghost and ensure he wasn't causing trouble, Ash glanced at Claire as she dug through her pack. He shook his head and returned to fiddling with the radios. He tried to ignore the tingle that lanced down his neck, but couldn't hold back a shiver. "I'm beginning to get the same feeling," Ash directed the thought towards the ghost. He reflected a moment on the growing uneasiness he felt around Claire. Ever since the euphoria of such a powerful ally revealing herself in a desperate time had worn off, Ash's mind had turned over and over on what it was about the woman that made him nervous. The restlessness had cost him no small amount of sleep, though he tried to tell himself it was only his nerves overreacting to the thought of the coming battle with Elm. "Want her to have an accident?" The ghost interrupted Ash's introspection. "No," Ash said aloud but under his breath. He glanced around and finished up the radios when he concluded no one had heard his slip. "Don't do anything." "But..." He wanted to berate himself for his lack of faith, but couldn't. "Watch her. Keep me updated." Happily, Haunter's mental tone mirrored Ash's as the ghost floated invisibly behind Claire. Shivering once and hissing out a sheet of smoke as she stood, Claire wrapped one arm around herself and flicked away her spent cigarette. Ready? Her blue eyes roamed from Oak, to Ash, to Janine. As the sound of flapping wings and heaving beasts filled the morning, Ash watched from Charizard's back as the little island on which their small party had camped dropped away beneath him. The sky seemed to race downwards as he rose, and eventually the trainer leveled off well over 1,000 feet above the ocean. Looking to his right and then his left, Ash smirked at the sight of the 3 other trainers lining up around him. Atop a Charizard he had long ago named Ember, Oak rode at the head of the formation. Behind the old man, riding a dragon almost 30 feet long, Claire leaned into her exotic saddle and held onto the grips built into the seat. Glancing through his thick visor at Janine as the girl banked and fell in beside him, Ash couldn't help but feel she looked a little out of place riding a Pidgeot alongside 2 Charizards and a Draco Knight. Also, he realized, seeing her in the T-51B's bulky helmet would take some getting used to. Check, Ash raised one hand to the side of his helmet and pressed the radio. We're all on the same channel. Yep, Janine's voice buzzed in Ash's ear as she gave him a thumbs up. Loud and clear, Claire tapped the slim radio mic sitting beside her lip. Oak turned around and signaled Ash with a wave. Sounds like we're good, said the older man, his voice muffled by the helmet as the sun glinted off his visor. From here on in though I want minimal chatter. We never know who might be listening. Angling slightly across the wind, riding up drafts and warm breezes, the 4 trainers continued to gain altitude as the hours rolled on and the sun reached its zenith in the sky overhead. When a storm front rolled in from the north and west and the wind began to pick up, Oak ordered that the party descend to keep out of the fast approaching clouds. The winds kicked up behind the trainers and began speeding them along. So quickly Ash wondered if he had momentarily blanked out. A dark shape rose out of the sea beneath and far ahead of them. As the island grew from a speck in the distance to a colossal swath of land and in what seemed like moments, Ash and the rest of his party came near enough to the coast that all of them could see the gargantuan city that began immediately at the coast, and stretched for miles inland. Much to Ash's surprise, most of the buildings stood only a few stories tall and the city lacked a wall to mark off its border. He quickly realized that many of the dozens of ships anchored off the coast, some as long as 1, 2, or even 3 city blocks and higher than any of the city's structures, looked capable of holding far more than any of Cinnabar City's warehouses. Trouble, Janine stated flatly over the radio, pointing ahead and down at one of the enormous ships. Ash scanned the scene. The twisting shadows thrown by the ships across the Red Sea confused his eyes until his eyes caught a number of quickly rising shapes that glinted like rubies in the dying sunlight. Following Janine's gesture, Oak quickly turned in his saddle to face the other trainers. Everybody stay right behind me, ordered the professor as the shapes gradually took on the distinctive outlines of men on the backs of Charizards and other large mounts. Challenge, an unfamiliar voice sounded over Ash's radio as the group of soldiers in black armor matched altitude with Ash's group. Judgment. Countersign, Oak hurriedly called out. Brimstone. Countersign accepted, the strikingly deep voice responded again as Oak signaled for the rest of his party to keep calm. Unknown approaching force, identify yourselves immediately or we will knock you out of our sky. This is Professor Samuel Oak. I'm here to meet with Field Marshal Josh A. Bashbeth. Oak raised one arm over his head and signaled the approaching trainers by opening his hand and closing it into a fist. As the other trainers grew closer and closer, Ash scanned their ranks and counted 15 in all. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead when he realized that 10 of the trainers rode Charizards, each one only a little smaller than his own if not the same size. The other 5 rode atop Pidgeots and carried exceptionally long spears with heads wrapped in sparking copper wire. Hold up, one of the soldiers' voices sounded over the radio. Oak is a marked friendly. Professor, the Field Marshal is at the rear command center just outside Cinnabar City. Sir, with due respect, you picked a hell of a time for a visit. We're here to kill Professor Deutzia Elm, Oak announced. Ash's ears rang with the silence for a moment as the other trainers in black armor overtook, and lined up alongside his own group after some quick maneuvers to change direction. The young savant's heartbeat thudded inside his helmet as his eyes darted amongst the menacing escorts. Professor, the deep voice returned over the radio as one of the Cinnabarian trainers gestured to get Oak's attention. Command has just ordered me to not look a heavily armed gift horse in the mouth. Sir, if you'll follow us we'll take you to the command center. Thank you, Oak responded. Ash looked to his side as one of the new arrivals, all of whom wore armor identical to the suits he, Oak, and Janine wore, waved to get the party's attention. The soldier motioned to one of the huge steel ships, the largest Ash thought, with a stabbing point. Flanked by the escorts, Ash's group banked and descended to a large area at the bow, cleared of all obstructions and sectioned off from the rest of the ship by a line of perhaps 50 soldiers in green and black uniforms. His saddle jerking beneath him as Charizard landed, Ash watched as the other trainers touched down on the surface of the ship and began dismounting. "Is this?" Ash almost stuttered as his feet touched the ground. "Asphalt." "Makes for a better landing surface," said one of the soldiers in black armor. "The Pokémon can grip it, it's lighter than concrete, and stands up to bad weather." "How does a boat with an asphalt deck float?" asked Ash, keeping one hand on Charizard's neck as the dragon growled and surveyed the surrounding soldiers. "It's a big-ass boat," answered the soldier, his tone humorless as he glanced sidelong at the enormous Dragonite, the Pokémon taking up almost a third of the landing zone as Claire slowly turned it around. While Oak and Claire stepped off their mounts and Janine curiously tapped the surface of the ship with her toe, Ash's Charizard hissed as one of the soldiers' Charizard shifted. Ash's Pokémon snapped at the other beast, his fangs clamping shut just short of the Pokémon's neck. In retaliation, the smaller dragon wheeled on Ash's mount and roared, rearing up on its hind legs and arcing its neck. "Down!" Ash demanded, grabbing his Charizard by the horn over its ear and jerking its head to one side as a soldier jumped to the other dragon's side and grabbed it by the saddle. Both trainers wrestled with their Pokémon for a second, pulling the beasts away from each other as the rest of Ash's party returned their mounts to their Pokéballs and watched. When Ash got his Charizard under control and the other trainer convinced his Pokémon to quiet down, Ash turned back to the soldiers and went for a Pokéball at his belt. Snapping it open and recalling Charizard in a gush of white light, he returned the ball to his belt. "Sorry about that," Ash sighed, facing one of the soldiers who had stepped closer in case the situation escalated. "Don't mention it. Happens all the time, just keep your animals in their Pokéballs at all times and we won't have problems," said the man in the uniform. He turned away and grumbled almost inaudibly under his breath. All sighing in relief to get out of the stuffy conditions, Ash, Janine, and Professor Oak pulled off their helmets and scanned the ranks of gathered soldiers. All but a few of the olive-skinned soldiers wore dark green uniforms supplemented with protective vests. Each carried a wide array of weapons on their belt, ranging from small maces, to knives, to more exotic devices such as miniature crossbows meant to be wielded in one hand. Many of the soldiers wore strapped across their backs much larger crossbows constructed from sturdy composites, meant to fire the forearm-sized bolts such soldiers carried in small quivers. The composition of the warriors' ranks surprised Ash once he took a second to look amongst the faces watching him. Among the soldiers not concealed from head to toe in black armor, Ash spotted an almost equal number of men and women representing every age group from teenager to senior. Many of the older troops, despite their age, carried themselves tall and bore the countenances of grizzled veterans, while the younger soldiers walked with as much purpose as their seniors, bearing demeanors just as serious. "Professor," said one of the warriors in black, approaching the group of trainers and removing his helmet. "Welcome back to Cinnabar." As Oak and the Cinnabarian shook hands, Ash recognized the man's voice as the one that had first greeted his party over the radio. The soldier's shaved head bore numerous scars in crisscrossing patterns, many of which wound down to the man's face, and graying stubble showed in the late evening sunlight around his mouth and up the sides of his jaw. "Captain Zivika," Oak responded. "It's been a while. Last time was in the Orange Islands, right?" The name sticking in his mind, Ash studied the man a little more, noting his sharp features and severe, if non-threatening, expression. "Shamuti Island," said the captain. "Right," Oak grinned awkwardly. "Those pirates and the gardening. Well anyway, moving on." He cleared his throat. "The field marshal's on the bridge," the captain gestured up towards the ship's tower. "If you would follow me." As the line of soldiers slowly broke apart and everyone returned to their duties, Ash, Claire, Janine, and Oak fell in behind the Zivika and 4 of his armored trainers as the procession advanced towards Steel Skyscraper on the other end of the ship. Leading them through a set of heavy doors, and up no fewer than a dozen flights of stairs that passed one sealed level of the tower after another, Zivika curtly advised the trainers from Kanto's mainland not to press Barshabeth, despite the field marshal having agreed to meet with Oak and his entourage. When the captain opened the heavy steel door, Ash and Janine held their helmets close, stepped over the threshold and followed Oak and Claire onto the bridge of the ship. Quickly scanning the scene, Ash spotted the dozen soldiers sitting around computer terminals glance briefly in the direction of the door, and returned to their work without missing a beat. Standing at one of the tall windows that lined 3 of the bridge's walls, a man in a plain green uniform turned around to face the newcomers. Folding his hands behind his back as the numerous medals on his chest caught the waning sunlight, the aged soldier's brow narrowed, further emphasizing just how deeply the wrinkles spread across his face ran. Ash felt the urge to incline his head as he met the field marshal's measured gaze. "Samuel," the old soldier addressed Oak, nodding as his solid voice reached across the bridge. He took a few steps towards the group and stopped when he stood 2 paces from the professor. "Back for a visit, Professor?" "Just here to assess the situation and deal with Elm," said Oak. "We'll be out of your hair in no time." The field marshal took a second to look over the group of gym leaders behind Oak. "I see you brought your own unit," he said, standing up perfectly straight. Despite his lean physique, the tall old man struck an imposing figure. "This is Janine, a gym leader from Fuchsia," Oak gestured to the girl in the purple hood. "Claire represents Blackthorn, and this," he hesitantly motioned to Ash, "is my grandson. Ash Ketchum currently heads up the Vermilion Gym." The old soldier's gaze snapped to Ash. The young gym leader staved off a flinch, and looked the marshal in the eye as the officer's already steely gaze hardened further. "Grandson," Barshabeth stated flatly. He whirled on Claire as she pulled out a cigarette. "No smoking on the bridge." He stared at her. A surprised look painting itself across her face, the thin tube already resting on her lips. Claire blinked before removing the cigarette and tucking it back into the case. She returned to a pocket at her side. "Delia's son," Oak clarified, regaining Barshabeth's attention before turning back to the other gym leaders. The professor cleared his throat again. "It might be best if the marshal and I had a moment to speak privately." Raising an eyebrow, Ash started to protest, but thought better of it. "Sure," Claire shrugged, her tone bordering on caustic. "I could do with a little fresh air." She turned and began walking towards the door. Janine glanced about the room again, her eyes darting over every face for an instant before turning to Ash with an expression tinged with curiosity. When Ash sighed and shrugged, the pair of trainers turned and began walking for the door where Captain Zivika waited on them. "They're the best," Ash heard Oak say, as he neared the door. "You won't find anyone better outside the Elite Four." "That's good, because I don't have many men to spare, Samuel," the officer turned back to face Oak. "Less than a month ago the Jotun Vanguard, 75,000 soldiers, arrived. A week ago, the main army group of 3.5 million landed and began advancing east towards where we're standing right now." Ash's breath caught as he followed Claire and Janine from the room. He tried unsuccessfully for a moment to wrap his head around the idea of an army that size. Ultimately, however, he gave up on the point and contented simply followed the others up another flight of stairs in the massive steel tower, and out onto a small observation deck. Fenced in by a railing at waist height, the platform jutted out and overlooked the ship's main deck. While Claire reached into her pack, Ash and Janine silently walked to the edge of the platform and leaned on the railing as they looked at the fleet of ships all around them. A wind blew in from the west and brought the smell of smoke to the platform, prompting Ash to look off towards the red sky where the sun had just set behind the island. From where he stood, he could make out in the distance, well beyond the hills that rose up around the borders of Cinnabar City, pillars and clouds of smoke. The dim and towering hazes seemed to glow red against the sunset and made Ash wonder exactly what kind of territory lay beyond those hills. He tried to imagine flying over a landscape occupied by a force of 3 million people, but his mind rejected the proposal. All he could see in his thoughts was a strip of land teeming with ants. "What am I even doing here?" Ash mumbled, leaning down and resting his elbows on the railing as he refocused on the fleet of metal ships. He glanced towards the girl when Janine's elbow bumped his. She smiled at him, and a second later he smiled back. The pair came just a little closer together, both too absorbed by other thoughts to consciously realize they were leaning in towards one another. As the wind shifted, Ash caught the brief but intense scent of some unique perfume. "Ash, you know something?" Janine said, her words soft enough to fade almost completely into the breeze, but spoken so close to him that her breath touched Ash's face. "What?" Ash mumbled back, a smile spreading on his face as his ears turned red. "I think," Janine went on as she brought her lips a fraction of a hair's breadth from Ash's, "I might just want." Snapping back to their senses, Ash and Janine turned when heavy footfalls came up behind them. The gnarled captain stepped up beside the two trainers and sighed, setting his helmet on the rail and staring down to the anchored ships. "Hell of a sight, isn't it?" Zivika smiled. He paused when Ash and Janine both only looked at him. "The fleet?" He waved. 500 warships, carrying 500,000 men, deploying 2,000 airborne trainers that spearhead the most powerful armed force in the history of the human race." The veteran grinned and took a satisfied breath. Ash let his eyes flit between the officer to his right, and the gym leader to his left. Janine looked up at him and rolled her big purple eyes. As the girl sighed and settled for resting her head in the crook of her partner's neck and shoulder, Ash stared down at the ship's black deck where a number of men stood around a flock of 10 exceptionally large Firo. As the Pokemon's trainers kept the birds calm, other soldiers pushing carts laden with large metal tubes approached the beasts and began fixing the steel pipes to harnesses under the birds' ribs. As soon as the birds hefted their payloads and walked a little farther down the deck, a new wave of trainers unleashed another flock of Firo, and another round of soldiers with carts laden with metal devices came rolling up. "Don't be too humble now," said Ash. He watched a moment longer as Zivika stared and Claire absent-mindedly lit up. "What are they doing down there?" he asked, looking at the metal cylinders. "What are those?" Zivika's grin widened for a second, though immediately afterward it faded into an almost disappointed gaze. "Hellfire-class incendiaries." "They're mate bombs," said the captain, going on to mutter under his breath, "something I wouldn't wish on anyone." "I've never heard of anything like that," Ash mused. "Can't call that surprising, Zivika. From what I hear, most mainlanders still fight with clubs and axes." Ash raised his eyebrows a little. "You don't?" "We haven't phased them out entirely, but most of our ground troops field heavy crossbows or shock spears," the captain responded, shifting around on the platform. "We experimented with explosive powder-powered firearms for a while, but they were too inefficient and spooked the trainers' Pokemon." "So," he looked between Ash and Janine, his tone growing almost too inquisitive for a man his age, "is it true that most mainland armies still fight in rows and columns? They just line up and shoot each other before rushing in with a sword while their trainers duke it out elsewhere?" Sort of," Ash said, confused by the question as he recalled the battle in Celadon. "But it gets confusing enough with a few hundred people, I can't imagine how it would work with thousands or—" Again he tried to visualize a million-man army, even more people. There wouldn't be a battlefield big enough. "That's why it doesn't work that way," Zivika watched as yet more trainers on the deck below fitted their flying mounts with bombs. "It's also why we don't use first-generation warfare anymore." Ash propped himself up on the rail and looked around towards the door where Claire stared off into space. He wondered exactly how long his grandfather would take. "I'll bite," said the gym leader. "What's first-generation warfare?" Smirking like a teacher who had been fishing for a question, Zivika leaned a little farther over the railing. "First general warfare is what most mainlanders in Kanto still apparently use. Everyone lines up in nice rows, shoots at each other, and then rushes into a melee. It's organized, in the beginning at least, but it causes massive casualties on all sides unless the belligerents have completely lopsided numbers of men or Pokemon. The next step in war's evolution," the captain went on as if quoting from notes he had taken in school, "came when commanders, mostly in Johto and Cinnabar, noticed that casualties were bad for an army. They began focusing on controlling lines of battle with technology and bypassing them with speed and smaller units of men. The way the Jotans are fighting now is a textbook case of second general combat tactics. They blitz around fortified positions to strike at the rear and disable a fort, then move on almost before the enemy has time to process that they've been crippled." Ash mused, letting himself get caught up in the lecture as he waited on Oak. "So how do you plan on beating that kind of speed?" he asked, almost sarcastically. "With even more speed," Zivika answered. "Cinnabar's tactics are geared towards utterly destroying a threat before it actually becomes threatening." "Sounds like you kinda botched that on this one," Ash grinned. Zivika shook his head. "Yeah," he rubbed his forehead. "I've got to applaud the Jotans on their willingness to fight dirty. They struck on the holiest day of the year when we only had 40,000 standing troops on the island. The rest of the 22 million were all on leave." Ash twitched and he looked over at the veteran. "You said 22? He trailed off. "You're shitting me, right?" "Nope," the captain shook his head. "Universal conscription. Every man and woman on the island between the ages of 14 and 55 serves in the army. Granted most of those aren't on active duty." He shrugged, "but in times of emergency command can call up roughly 2/3 of the reserves without completely wrecking the economy. We're basically our own little continent down here with 9 big cities and plenty of small towns and farmland in between. Needless to say, every bit of that goes into supporting the army." "That's insane," Ash snapped. "Your entire population? Every single one of you, is a trained soldier? Why? You try living on a chunk of rock between the Orange Islands, and Johto, all of whom want your little chunk of rock home for themselves." Zivika laughed once and reached up to scratch his stubble.
Or field's massive armies of brainwashed and suicidally fanatical slaves wielding technology we can't rival with anything but brute force. The Orange Navy is nearly twice as big as ours, and only their lack of an effective air force makes them any less dangerous than Johto, which, as you can see, isn't as harmless as they come across.
Wow, Ash muttered.
Why do they all hate you so much?
Zivika closed his eyes and shrugged.
They're all envious of our dashing good looks and beautiful women. All they can think is, damn. If only we had that gorgeous little island, we could be as beautiful as those people.
Zivika opened one eye and chuckled at the confused expression on Ash's and Janine's faces.
Nah,
he went on.
There's probably more to it than that, but I can't really say what.
Ash took a breath and glanced down at Janine, who just silently rested her head on him.
So,
he said after a second's pause.
You don't know why they hate you?
The captain shook his head. More serious now, he sighed.
Not for sure. I know it's gone on for generations. My grandfather fought their grandfathers, my father fought their fathers, and everyone is trying to get back at everyone else for killing someone their side cared about.
Ash thought for a second, struck by the familiarity of the scenario.
Do you think it will ever stop? No,
the captain stated flatly.
You look at Pokemon, and most of them are content to eat, reproduce, and die. They don't build armies or go to war. Even the ones trained for battle don't understand the concept of a war. They just do what they're told. Then you've got humans, who will go to astonishing lengths to kill each other over anything from insults to resources. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just who we are. War is what we do, and with as good as we've gotten at it, I don't see that ever changing.
From the other side of the platform, Claire scoffed and snapped her lighter shut with a metallic ring.
Aren't you friendly? Said the Jotun gym leader. So while we're waxing philosophical, why don't you share something with me, like why you're so talkative, or how you plan on killing Elm?
Both Ash and the Cinnabarian captain raised an eyebrow while Janine straightened up.
I understand you're a little out of your element,
Zivika said with a tone both firm but amicable,
ma'am, but there's no need to be rude. I came here to deal with Elm,
Claire growled, startling Ash with her break from her usual calm.
Every second we stand around is one less second we have before things escalate even further and Lance decides to do something himself. Which would be,
Ash said slowly,
bad. Don't get cute,
Claire glared at Ash.
You're new on the scene and you don't know how things work. If Lance ever gets off his throne, it's because things are so out of control that nothing else will fix it. And let me tell you, none of us want that.
Ash braced himself against a wind that gnawed at the back of his neck.
Sorry,
he put his hands up disarmingly.
You're right, I am the new guy. If I said something stupid, I'm sorry.
Claire's icy blue eyes flitted between the captain and the two gym leaders before she took a breath.
No,
she said with a sigh.
I'm sorry for snapping. Why so tense?
Janine asked quietly.
Everything the good captain said is true,
the woman gestured at Zivika, who relaxed a little,
but in more ways than he knows. What I was told, what you deserve to know, and what Professor Oak is undoubtedly telling Barshaveth right now, is that we're sitting on a sleeping Snorlax of a political situation. Johto's invasion of Cinnabar came in direct defiance of Lance's orders to the Western powers. For reasons we can't determine, Elm really wanted there to be an invasion on Cinnabar. He wanted it so much that he got Johto, and the Orange Islands in on the act.
Zivika was on alert in an instant.
What are you saying?
He barked.
That if Johto fails, the Orange Islands and are extremely likely to invade immediately thereafter,
Claire explained.
Lance has had rangers following Elm's trails for the last 5 years. He's spent a lot of time in a lot of places, and everywhere he goes he gets help and military buildup ensues. Intelligence reports from more than 50 rangers suggests that it wouldn't stop at Cinnabar. Elm is trying to ignite something much bigger. What's he after?
Ash asked, his face hardening as his eyes narrowed.
What's he stand to gain?
Shaking her head, Claire bit her lip.
We don't know. Lance and Agatha both think this has something to do with wanting to kill Oak and the Elite Four, and I'm inclined to agree with them. If that's the case, and if Elm does manage to unite all of Johto, and the Orange Archipelago, we might not be able to stop it.
Ash shivered.
So why aren't the Elite Four doing anything?
Ash asked, his mouth beginning to go dry, despite the excessive humidity.
They sent me, didn't they?
Asked Claire.
That's a whole lot more than nothing. Besides, there's been a lot of new developments in Malbolge recently.
The name ringing like a bell in his mind, Ash reflected for a second on how long it had been since he thought of that place or why Team Rocket was trying to access the depths of the cave. For a moment he almost chuckled at how trivial that all seemed now, but something in the back of his mind whispered that Malbolge remained at the center of the equation now unfolding around him.
Developments.
Ash pushed.
Such as the wild Pokemon there are getting,
Claire paused as if to think,
less wild, but no less powerful. There haven't been any attacks on Indigo for months, which has never happened before. When Lance sent rangers into the cave, they all reported that the upper levels were completely abandoned, no Pokemon to be found. When he sent an expedition deeper only a single ranger came back, and he had been reduced to a whimpering basket case who couldn't stop crying about monsters in the dark. After that, Lance put the entire Indigo Guard on alert,
Claire went on.
He and Agatha went into Malbolge, and came back reporting that Pokemon in the upper levels had gone completely docile. Even the normally feral breeds like Graveler and Sandslash had gone almost comatose and just stood around in groups of up to 100 Pokemon. Lance could only guess at the number gathering there. With all the weird shit going on in the world, is it any wonder the man is getting a little jumpy?
Ash turned as if to look over his shoulder when he heard Haunter calling for his attention. Ghosts can do that to Pokemon, the Spectre whispered. So can psychics, Ash thought reflexively, a chill shooting down his spine as soon as the idea registered.
So what are we supposed to do?
Asked the young gym leader. He looked between Zivika, Claire, and Janine.
Simple,
Claire answered.
We kill Elm and hope the world doesn't blow up. And if that lack of leadership doesn't defuse the situation?
Janine asked. Claire crossed her arms and fidgeted a lock of hair, looking between Captain Zivika and the other two trainers.
Then we hope that we're better at war than everyone else,
the woman in blue spit her spent cigarette over the edge of the tower. Light had long since ceased streaming in through the windows lining the ship's bridge, but still Professor Oak and Field Marshal Barshabeth continued their conversation in hushed tones. Their discussion droned out by the clicking of keyboards, the low voices of the operators behind the computers relaying orders, and the humming lights. The two old men stared out the eastern windows as they spoke.
What about this apprentice of his?
Oak asked, under his breath.
What can you tell me about her?
Barshabeth folded his arms in front of his chest and shifted back, staring off into the dark beyond the windows.
Nothing, except that she's good,
he answered.
None of my men can touch her, and frankly it's wearing on my patience. Elm's guards mean nothing. They're window dressing. It's that apprentice. She plays the skirmisher, darting into and away from battle faster than any soldier I've ever seen. That of course lets Elm play the slow but unstoppable Snorlax and crash through any defense we can put up. If your team can get them separated, I think you might have a shot.
Oak reached up and scratched the top of his head.
Do you know anything about her personally? Where did she come from? We're not sure,
the field marshal answered.
We've seen her use a Blaziken and a Sceptile, which suggests Hoenn. I'd say that might be coincidence if I hadn't stopped believing in such a thing. Regardless, you'll need someone fast to deal with her.
Looking out the window for a second, Oak thought back to the previous few days, when he had watched Ash riding Charizard and Arcanine. The thought made him visibly cringe, but he couldn't deny Ash's penchant for speed.
Don't worry yourself with that,
Oak muttered.
I think Ash can answer her. So, to deal with Elm once and for all,
Barshabeth said, measured tone deepening further as he turned to face Oak.
Apollyon rides again. One last time,
Oak let a hesitant grin cross his features.
I'm getting old, Joshabe. This will have to be my last fight. You know that's not how it works, Samuel,
said Barshabeth.
Our last fight is the one we die finishing. I'm not Cinnabarian,
Oak responded to the old soldier.
You married in,
Barshabeth said, almost casually.
And left,
said Oak.
We don't need reminding,
the field marshal shook his head.
Never mind. Consider that off the record.
The two men stopped as the door to the bridge opened and two soldiers in black armor, leading Ash, Janine, Captain Zivika, and Claire entered.
Perfect timing,
sighed Oak.
Captain,
the field marshal walked forward to meet the officer.
You've been bitching for weeks for a shot at Elm. Well, congratulations, here's your chance.
The old soldier looked between the trainers from the mainland, then back to the captain.
Dragon Company will be following Samuel and his team north to intercept Elm and his escorts who are en route Blaine's gym. Suit up, Captain, you leave at 0500 hours.
A wide smirk spread on Zivika's face.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
As the soldiers saluted each other, Oak approached Ash and the others. Claire stepped forward and informed Oak that she had brought them up to speed on the situation, and Oak nodded his approval. The old man ran a hand through his graying hair and patted Ash on the shoulder.
Good luck,
Oak said.
I'd tell you to get some rest, but... Catch 'em!
Captain Zivika barked from the other side of the bridge, making everyone except for Janine, Oak, and Barshabeth leap in surprise.
You're with me on deck in 10 minutes.
The gnarled officer strode across the bridge and stopped next to Ash.
Hey!
Ash asked.
What's going on?
The captain smirked wickedly.
You're flying with Dragon Company in the morning. I've heard you're good, but it's time you got at least a few hours of genuine training under your belt.
Ash both livened and withered a little at the prospect, a sudden wave of fatigue rolling over him even as his senses sharpened in anticipation of the lessons.
Don't we leave first thing in the morning?
He asked.
Come on, you can sleep in the saddle while we're in transit.
The captain slapped him on the shoulder and walked by the trainers towards the exit.
10 minutes.
Ash waited until the captain had gone and the field marshal had returned to speaking with his subordinates on the bridge. He turned back to Oak with a questioning expression.
Their house,
the professor shrugged.
Their rules. Besides, there will be time to sleep on the way and I think you might need the experience. As for us.
He glanced at Janine and Claire.
We should probably turn in.
Waiting until Oak and Claire had both turned for the door, Janine stepped up to Ash. Quick as a thought, she stood on the tips of her toes and kissed him on the cheek, then reappeared by the door. Over her shoulder she winked at him, and disappeared after Professor Oak, leaving Ash stunned and standing like a statue for a second. End of chapter.